Hello, ladies and gentlemen of Kathos. I am Captain Jeffrey McJeffer, and today I am here to test a new form of presenting that I had an idea to use for my story. I had grown tired of the general usage of typing out a Word document, mostly because of the fact that this is very time-consuming for me, and I normally spend about 3 to 4 hours planning and typing it out. I decided to try and do an audio-visual format solely because of the fact that I can do this much more easily and is maybe a more entertaining way of attempting to present my story. I will actually not be presenting a chapter of the means to an end, and will instead be presenting a test chapter for another fanfiction for Iron Grip Marauders that I've been thinking about starting, that is not set in the future and will not be completely tearing apart the world. So without further ado, let me begin the story. The hiss of steam, the roar of mighty diesel engines, the clanking of gears and the grinding of treads, the occasional gunfire in the distance or explosion of a cannon or artillery piece, the sound of junk piles falling over from hundreds of feet in the air, the dropping of the crane chains as they lifted mighty beasts of old and moved their metal skeletons across the various scrapyards. This all combined to create a giant symphony in the Walker Boneyard. The cacophony, it could drive an average man unaccustomed to life in the place mad. But for Hans Fredrickson, this was normal every day. Hans Fredrickson, a young boy of 16, had lived in the Walker Boneyard his whole life. All he had in his possession were the clothes on his back, a grimy pair of brass mechanic's goggles, and his father's pocket watch, which had been passed down to him after his father's death some years before. As he walked down the streets, he always looked around to see if there was any scrap metal worth salvaging in the various piles of junk lying all over the place. As a poor boy, he normally had to salvage whatever he could from wherever he could and sell it for money. Barely surviving, he often went without food for many days, and most of his water was provided only by that of the rain. As Hans walked to the market to get the pieces he needed to complete his vehicle, he went over his plan to leave the boneyard again and again in his mind. Once he'd left, he was headed for a place of myth and fable and legend, a place feared by the general public. Anchor Point. Some of the older kind of retired marauder captains that had quit with their days of burning, pillaging, and raping had told him of the place. A fortress high in the mountains, long ago abandoned, but then repurposed by the criminals of society, now a safe haven for them. He'd been told that there was only one way in and 2 ways out, and you didn't want the second one because it was a long fall down. Once we reached Anchor Point, Hans hoped to find some form of job at a place he'd heard about called Jasmine's Gentlemen's Club, a place where there was always money to be made. He even considered, after getting money of his own, to make his own marauder band. As much as he despised the folk, he did think he could be different, since he knew what it was like to be normal as well. After reaching the store, he browsed their wares, finding the bolts and other various pieces he needed, carefully inspecting each for any dents and other various marks of wear and tear. Satisfied with his collection, he paid with the last of his money and left, when he bumped into a man. The man was exceedingly tall, nearly 6'5" in height. He wore a very long, fine pair of black dress pants, a white dress shirt tucked into it. Over this, he wore a long blue, double-breasted overcoat. The overcoat shoulders had very, very eccentric, very colorful gold pauldrons upon them. He seemed to be an officer of sorts, but had no markings determining any military. His hair was blonde, very curly, and fell nearly to his shoulders. His face was relatively clean-shaven, save for a light mustache upon his upper lip. His eyes a blazing blue that seemed to pierce into his very soul. Hans frighteningly stepped back as he bumped into the man, quickly apologizing for the inconvenience. The man merely chuckled and looked down at the lad, patting him on the head, and said, "Well, I guess I should watch where I'm going next time, son. I must be on my way. Maybe I'll see you around. Good day to you." The man walked away, and Hans quickly ran back to his Ontos, his heart racing. Hans immediately began work on his vehicle once he got home. After 12 hours of sweat and bloodshed, he'd finally completed it. The thing was a four-wheeled, bike-like vehicle. It could seat only one person. It was designed for all-terrain purposes and had optimal fuel consumption rates, as he was in the center of the boneyard and needed to get outside and far past the outside of the boneyard to make it to anchor point. He had not money to buy more fuel and would have to salvage what he could along the way. As he prepared to leave, suddenly alarm bells began to ring out through the whole boneyard. He heard the click-clack of soldiers walking down the streets, the rumble of tanks, and he feared that it was that time again. Marauders coming through. This was not the time that they needed to be here. He had to get out fast, and he had to make sure that they couldn't stop him. Hans quickly gathered what supplies he might need, hopped on his bike, revved the engine, and attempted to charge down the middle of Main Street. Unfortunately, he was stopped near immediately by a line of Marauder troopers and a tank destroyer. The troopers instantly opened fire on him without question, bullets whizzing all around him. He turned around and attempted to run in the other direction, only to find that he was blocked off by Arcos. Caught in the middle of a maelstrom, he didn't know what he was going to do. Lead flew everywhere. The tank destroyer carefully took aim and was about to fire when suddenly it exploded in a massive fiery blaze of glory as the Bethesda cannon's artillery shell rained down upon it. The rest of the Marauders on Main Street were soon ended in the same way as the tank destroyer. Hans, highly confused by this occurrence, looked back over his shoulder to see charging over a nearby pile of junk a line of tank destroyers followed by Bethesda cannons and Royal artillery. Leading them at the front was a man sitting high atop a white stallion. Hans quickly recognized this man as the one that he'd bumped into earlier in the market, and from this distance, while he could tell that the man was screaming orders at his soldiers, he could not quite hear what he was saying. He immediately engaged the Marauders and shredded them, fiery blaze of explosions, artillery shells raining down, and musket fire ripping them to shreds. It was over in a matter of minutes. Hans watched in awe, as he'd never been this close to a battle before, certainly not one so intense, and certainly while not being held at gunpoint, and being demanded that he hand over all his money and anything else of value. After it was over, the man came riding down Main Street on his horse and saw Hans sitting on his quad bike. He quickly rode up to Hans and recognizing him as the boy from earlier, said, "Ah, well, hello there, son. I see I just saved your life. The name's Johann. Maybe you'd consider coming along with me. I'm on my way to Anchor Point, and I could use a smart lad like you. Or at least I'll assume you're smart. That seems to be some form of custom-built bike, and I'm going to assume you built it yourself. I could use a good mechanic. A few of my tanks keep breaking down. Maybe you can help me." Hans, jumping at the sound of Anchor Point, readily agreed and left off with the man, his forces immediately heading out of the boneyard and on their way across the fields of Cathos.